Hello everyone and welcome to another Sunday edition of your weekday program, The Daily Debate, here on Nile TV International. I'm your host for tonight, Nancy Sarah Barakat, and tonight we're discussing a topic that has garnered worldwide attention, but almost never from a Middle Eastern or Muslim perspective, and that is the rise of Islamophobia in the West. We've heard many anti-Islamic hate speeches that have spread in the West, the rise of the far-right parties in a number of European countries, including Britain's UKIP and France's National Front, but nothing perhaps has caused more of a stir and more of a controversy than the recent statements that were made by US presidential hopeful Donald Trump. Now, Trump has called for a total shutdown and tracking of all Muslims in the United States. Statements that have not gone down well with his business partners here in the region, or even with some members of his own parties. The leaders of a number of Arab countries, including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and perhaps even European, Britain and Canada, as well as other demonstrators, have protested the statements, describing them as racist and foolish. But nevertheless, one cannot ignore that Donald Trump does have supporters and does have people who support his ideologies, and at times have even carried out hate crimes against innocent Muslims. All this prompts us to ask, what has given this rise to Islamophobia? To which extent has the media helped flare up this hate against Muslims? What is the impact of this anti-Islamic rhetoric by some against the Muslim communities living in the West? Does the Muslim community itself have a bigger role to play? That's what we're going to be discussing later on tonight on the program. But as usual, there are other stories making headlines today, and first of all, we'll be starting with President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who appointed yesterday 11 new provisional governors along with 5 new deputy ministers. According to presidential spokesman Ala Youssef, the governors were appointed to the governorates of Alexandria, Suez, Gharbiya, Kafr al-Sheikh, Aswan, Port Said, Sharqiya, Minya, Giza, Qalyubiyya and Bani Suef. The new deputies will serve in the ministries of higher education, health, communication, education, as well as housing. I do have a telephone with us to give us more analysis on this particular development, but I'm not sure who it is that I have with me. Good evening, sir.
Very good evening. Hello?
Hello, a very warm welcome. Let me start off by asking you, what were your thoughts about, the reshuffle, and what do you think prompted this reshuffle at this particular time?
Okay, I believe that change is too much there in lots of positions. It's not only governorates, but we saw change in the central bank, some institutions like revisionary institutions and police leaders, and we in these all steps we are finding a chance to improve the level of government and the governing system. Lots of changes were there. If we look to the governorates, that change happened, and it seems that the government is going to more rational system in order to provide better services to the citizens, and improve also the ability of states in these governorates.
Right. Do we know much about the new governors?
In fact, it seems that there was issue in some governorates. We saw the issue of Alexandria, and it seems that the government the government needs to have better figures in these specific 17 governorates. And also on the same time, we are seeing some governorates like Sharqiya and Alexandria. The position was empty for quite a long time in Alexandria, and before few days from the change. Although President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi gave those new governors lots of advice in order to start their career by getting better services to the people and proceeding the needs of the citizens and having share with the ministers in the issue of giving the essential needs to the citizens in a cheap way, encouraging investment, making the best use of the income in their governorates.
And let me just finally ask you, I mean, to what extent do these reshuffle again send a message that if you as a minister or as a governor aren't doing your job fully, then you will be held accountable?
Yes, in fact, frankly, some of those governors just appointed in the same year by January or February. So it seems to me or to each and every minister or governor that once you are not doing your job in a proper manner, in a clear manner, in having new mentality to be able to deal with the problems and to get solutions, maybe in most of the time these solutions will be new kind of solutions or having a level of being flexible. So I believe that these are strong messages that once you are not doing well, once you are not doing in a fantastic executive way, so you will not have to stay in your position.
Right. I thank you very much, Dr. Nedal Mustafa, Head of the Diplomatic Department at the Presidency, for your time and for your insights. Another top story that also involved President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi saw him ordered for the formation of a team to investigate corruption allegations in the media following last week's claims by the head of the Central Auditing Organization, Hisham Ginina, that corruption in 2015 has cost the country some 600 billion Egyptian pounds. The committee will be headed by the chief of the Administrative Control Authority and will consist of representatives on the Ministries of Justice, Interior, Planning and Finance, in addition to Central Auditing Organization Deputy Chief Hisham Badawi. The committee will draft an urgent report and submit it to the President, after which it will be presented to the public. Earlier this year, 11 top officials at the Ministry of Agriculture were referred to the judiciary over accusations of embezzlement and facilitating the seizure of public funds, and resigned Agriculture Minister Salah Hilal was arrested over corruption charges back in September. Well, that's all the top stories I have for you for now. Let's take a look at our first report for the evening and the recent anti-Islamic statements that were made by public figures who contribute to the increase of Islamophobia in the West. And then we'll be back to start our discussion. Stay with us.
The startling rise of Islamophobia in the West in recent years has been defined by the promotion of deliberate media hatred for Islam, attacks on and terrorization of the faith of Muslims. Time is over to present an overall view of contemporary Western Islamophobia, targeting global Muslims who are forced to be on perpetual run for recover from anti-Muslim onslaught of US-led Western sources. While the term Islamophobia is now widely used, both the term itself and the underlying concept of Islamophobia have been heavily criticized. The causes and characteristics of growing Islamophobia are still debated. On the other hand, some public figures, such as U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump, had made anti-Muslim statements that stressed the fact that Islamophobia has widely spread in the West. Trump dominated his Republican primary race with his penchant for provocative and often comments with seemingly little regard of their ramifications. But his recent call for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States, following his openness to the idea of establishing a database to track those that are already within the country, is beginning to cost him business opportunities in the Middle East. The frontrunner explained that he was open to wholesale surveillance of Muslim Americans and warrantless search of mosques. Trump then doubled down on his recent proclamation that he was open to shutting down American mosques, claiming he would have absolutely no choice if some bad things happen in a mosque. Trump campaign manager said Trump's proposed ban would apply to everybody, including Muslims seeking immigration visas, as well as tourists seeking to enter the country. Another Trump staffer confirmed that the ban would also apply to American Muslims who were currently overseas, including members of the military and diplomatic service. However, Trump defended his call for a halt on Muslim visitors to the U.S. as he and the rest of the Republican presidential field faced in the final debate of the year with fear of another terrorist attack growing among the electorate. One of his fellow candidates apologized to the Muslim world for Trump's proposal, and another called him a chaos candidate, but the billionaire businessman was undeterred, claiming that his Muslim pose wasn't an attack on religion but a defense of American security. Also in France, Prime Minister Manuel Valls followed Trump's call for a ban on Muslims entering the U.S. with a comment on Twitter.
بأجيال قوية أحقق أمانيكي،
بإيدي أبنيكي، أجتهد لأعطيكي،
أخضر أراضيكي.
محلاها عشت الفلاح مطمن قلبه مرتاح.
أبهر العالم بيكي.
جميلة بكل ما فيكي. بدمي أحميكي.
Be the first to know. The news live at the site of the event. Information on events as they are happening. If it's breaking news, it's Nile TV. Have you got a good story? Get in touch with Nile TV. Send us your videos, pictures, and stories. Email us on our website. Contact us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter. And also Google+. Be part of making...
Very warm welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to welcome here in the studio Mr. Hussam Nassar, former Deputy Minister of Culture. Thank you very much for coming in tonight. Also joining me is Engineer Hassan Shaban, former Assistant to the Chairman of the Left Party. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me. Appreciate it.
Mr. Hussam, let me start off with yourself. When do you think the term itself, Islamophobia, was first coined?
Very good question.
I think it was immediately after the Iranian Revolution. Because of possibly, as I recall, Ali Shariati was trying to mix Islamic fundamentalism with the revolution.
Right.
And it immediately became an Islamophobia. But it was kind of trained until the Afghani war and the aftermath of the Afghani war and the Muslim Brotherhood and the Wahhabis. They're all belonging to the same fundamentalist kind of Islamic movements. Hence the Islamophobia started to escalate, but the nutcracker was 9/11.
Right.
That was, I mean, a major event, extremely magnified by the media, and started the whole Islamophobia.
I'm wondering if 9/11 was the trigger, because back, and I don't know if you recall this or not, back in 1996, Samuel L. Huntington, he wrote a book called The Clash of Civilizations, and he dedicated like this whole chapter about Islam being the new enemy of the West post Cold War. Do you think Islam was particularly chosen to be the West's new enemy?
That's a kind of a misinterpretation.
Right.
Huntington did not refer to Islam only. Right. He referred to the Confucians as well. Maybe the West was trying to create an enemy after the fall of the Soviet Union. And looking at Huntington, you cannot take him from one perspective. Right. Some people are claiming that Huntington was not actually an advert of an Islamic or a clash of civilization. Maybe he was warning against civilization. However, the kind of discrimination that he made, dividing the world into 6 major blocks, was kind of antagonistic to a lot of people. So maybe he was perceived in not in the right fashion.
Right.
However, as I've said, the Islamophobia itself, or preparing the next enemy, immediately took after the Iranian Revolution.
Right. And if I come to you, Mr. Hassan, do you think, though, that Islam was chosen, was picked out by the West to be its new enemy post-Cold War?
Actually, Muslims helped the West.
Definitely.
Helped the West to choose them as an enemy. They did not really try to present a positive image to Islam to the West. Also, the Muslims who actually migrated to the West in massive numbers in the US and maybe also in the UK, though they were treated in a very moderate fashion, and they were allowed to practice the religion with no constraints, actually separated themselves as if they were living in a ghetto. Right. They actually tried to maintain their culture that they had in the Middle East. Maybe if I choose the Middle East as an example, and they really liked the way they lived in the Middle East, and they took their culture with them to the U.S. and they lived in almost ghettos.
Right. Is that necessarily a bad thing for one to hold on to one's culture? We see it with the Chinese community wherever they go. You see it also with the Japanese culture. They do try to maintain as well.
The difference between the Chinese and, like they have the Chinese culture, whatever, and the Muslims have they have a feeling always that they are different, and they should be away, or they should get together and reject the sinful Western civilization. Amazing, because actually what we see today, all the Syrians who are migrating, running away from ISIS in Syria, and they are really treated in a very, very decent way in the European community. And while their neighboring countries in the Middle East refused to accept them. Right. So actually we have a problem. Muslims have a problem in accepting others. So if I have a problem as a Muslim in accepting others, what do we expect from others? They will look upon us as if we're completely different from them. Right. And there is a big wall between Muslims in these countries. You will see a lot of very successful Muslims in the US and in the UK. But again, Muslims who insist to look different or to behave in a different way and try to impose themselves definitely will create a negative impression.
See, the thing is, when you say that, one can counter your argument by saying, well, we have, we've got punks, we've got the emo sort of look, we've got these people look different, we've got the goth look. These are people who choose to look different, to stand out in society, but yet they are somehow not marginalized. There must be something within perhaps the mentality, the interpretation, rather than an external appearance, that has garnered this sort of segregation. Sometimes, if we take France, for example, as an example, there has always been a feeling amongst the Muslim community there, especially the North African community, that they are second citizens. Now, one cannot deny that this is a problem within French society. It has nothing to do, to a large extent, with the North Africans themselves, because throughout history they adapted to the language, they adapted very much to the way of life. Don't you think as well that the West has a responsibility, that it has somehow, in one way or another, segregated these societies within their own countries?
Let's face it, definitely there is a difference between just a regular French citizen and somebody who came from abroad or even was born in France from North African parents. There is a difference. It takes more than one generation or two generations to merge with the French community as such. But again, once you will feel that you're different from the citizen in this particular country, you will isolate yourself automatically, morally. And
what if the system itself makes me feel different?
I will not really argue this. Maybe the system imposes this. But again, I think there is a problem with the people who migrated to these countries. They are different. Why do you expect them suddenly to accept you as just a Frenchman or an American? Yes, it will take 1 or 3 or 4 generations. Americans from African origin say, let's not really talk about Islamophobia. Let's talk about the American Africans. American Africans suffered for so many years till the community, the country, the society accepted them. So it takes more than one generation to merge.
Right.
But you cannot really accelerate this. And due to the impatient, you're very eager to be treated in a fair way. The reaction is a little bit uptight. And it will not really work unless we give it time and we prove to the new communities that we live in that we deserve to be treated in a fair way.
Right.
They will not really accept us because we are different.
Right.
We are different, and we try to magnify this difference.
Right.
We do not try to hide it. We magnify it. We think we are better, and if they discover the way we pray, the way we fast, we do not drink, and just expose all this and try to impose it over others, this will not be acceptable in the West.
Mr. Hassan, do you think it's a problem with the community itself, as Mr. Hassan is saying, or do you think it's the Europeans or the West itself which has chosen to segregate this particular social grouping, or do you think it's a combination of both?
It's, far too complicated to tag it from one dimension.
Right.
It's multi-dimensional.
Okay.
But we have to stop generalizing. We're not talking about Muslims at large. We're talking about a certain Muslim identity that is actually...
But now the sentiment in the West is if you're Muslim, you're turned back.
Of course.
At the airport.
However, but the Muslims Engineer Hassan was referring to was not actually the generally speaking Muslim. They are kind of fanatics. So it takes two to tango. The West definitely does not make the effort, the full effort to integrate Muslims in their societies, and the Muslims or the fanatic Muslims or the radical Muslims or the Muslims are making it difficult for the West to assimilate that kind of falsified culture. You've asked a very good question. Why is it not the case for the Chinese and the Japanese? Because the Chinese and the Japanese are native cultures. However, the Muslims that we see in ghettos, they are trying to be extremely self-indulged, are not really representing the native kind of liberal Islam. It is kind of an imagined Islam rather than a true Islam. Kind of a hypothetical Islam. However, we as moderate Muslims who are capable of fitting in and capable of convincing the West that we're tete-a-tete, we have to make the effort as well to marginalize the effect of these kinds of Muslims that are hurting the religion, hurting the identity of us all, to the extent that we're being all tagged as Muslims, as terrorists, as radicals, which we really are not.
Right. But this hypothetical Islam that you say exists, and obviously it's very extreme, it's very strict, and so on and so forth. Who's to blame for the rise of that? Because again, are we talking about the key institutions? Are we talking about madrasas, for example, in India and Pakistan that exist and sort of, fuel that very extremist ideology? Are we talking about going way back and saying that the Wahhabi ideology gave rise to this extremist sect, if you will, or extremist thought in Islam? Who's to blame for that?
We have to differentiate between even the different factions of fundamentalism. There are the peaceful fundamentalism. Wahhabis, for example, are very peaceful. The Salafis are peaceful. And there is the radical faction of the fundamentalists, like the Muslim Brotherhood, like Jabhat al-Nusra, like Daesh, like whatever. And there is the revolutionary ones, like Iran was trying to revolutionize the whole region. So there are different factions even inside the fundamentalism. And the fundamentalism is not really exclusive to Islam. Actually, fundamentalism started in the Christian religion by the Presbyterians and the Puritans and the Quakers, and it started in the United States.
Right.
The Jewish have their own version of fundamentalism. The Buddhists, the Hindus, every faith, every religion has its own fundamentalist kind of thinking that they are purifying their religion. But it gets to the extreme when they say that God is on our side.
Right.
So it's definitely not on yours. Here is where it become, socially unacceptable. Even in here, why did we have this major quarrel with the Muslim Brotherhood? Because they thought that God is on their side, right? And we are not following God. This is where you take it to the extreme, and hence you have to intervene. So we have intervened, for example, by ousting them. The West intervened by having someone like Trump saying we will ban Muslim and we will spy against them in the mosques.
Right. How did you see, the reason why this came into the spotlight most recently is because of very controversial statements made by Donald Trump, who is a front runner in the Republican Party's race for the presidency, and who has a massive amount of following, and people who do believe what he says, that Muslims should be banned and that Muslims should be monitored, so on and so forth. What did you make of that sort of rhetoric?
A smart political move. He's trying to gain the populace.
Right.
If we remember Hitler, for example, how did Hitler became the sole kind of ruler in Germany? By creating the enemy of communism and magnifying that kind of feared enemy. So Trump, though he looks like an idiot, but he's really not. He's a very smart, very shrewd business person. He understands the nitty-gritties of politics. So he's making statements, magnifying that fear in order to gain the voters on his side, which seems to be very successful.
Well, I'd like to discuss this further, but I'm told that I have to take the following report, highlighting perhaps some of the reactions from world leaders about the recent statements that were made by Donald Trump. Let's take a look at that, and then we'll be back to continue our discussion.
Donald Trump's call for a sweeping ban on Muslims entering the United States prompted protests around the world from national leaders to ordinary citizens, even provoking calls for him to be banned from Britain. Prominent politicians make a general habit of not interjecting with partisan comments during other countries' election cycles, but Trump's enduring front-runner status in the run-up to the start of Republican primary voting and the escalation in his inflammatory remarks persuaded some to break cover. In Egypt, a statement from Dar al-Ifta called Trump's remarks hate rhetoric that would create tension and a hostile stance within American society against the Egyptian people. Chairman of Kingdom Holding Company Prince Al-Walid bin Talal tweeted that Donald Trump is a disgrace and should pull out of the United States presidential race. Britain's Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron said in a statement that he completely disagrees with Trump's comments and regards them as divisive, unhelpful and quite simply wrong. Labour's Home Office Minister Jack Dromey also called Trump a dangerous fool who should not be allowed within 1,000 miles of British shores. In an unusual move, the Canadian government, which usually refrains from commenting on foreign election campaigns, joined the chorus of those criticizing Trump. The impact of Trump's comments and his supporters' reaction reached right across Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim-dominated state, and into Australia. During Trump's hate speech, protesters chanted, "Trump is trying to bring us down," targeting people black and brown as they tried to storm a side entrance into the speech at Manhattan's The Plaza Hotel as security staff pushed them away. Later in his speech, other protesters from various groups stood up to denounce his recent comments to temporarily bar Muslims from entering the United States.
Hassan, let me come back to you. Obviously, your thoughts perhaps on these statements by Donald Trump and the fact that he does have support. I mean, I think that's more worrying than the actual statements.
Well, I don't doubt it that he's got supporters, and he will gain some voters for that, because he was addressing a very serious matter that concerns the American society. I mean, the presence of a group of people who does not, who cannot merge and always create or a source of problems every now and then. So, in spite of the fact that Muslims in the U.S. did not really create such problems, but they're connected to Muslims abroad. And this is a new enemy to the U.S. Let me just illustrate on a very serious matter. In my humble opinion, I think that the U.S. actually chose the Muslims to be a tool to upset the peace in the Middle East and other regions. And Muslims took the bait, and they actually have extremist organizations, and I think ISIS themselves were created by the U.S. And so far there is no deny from the U.S. that they had nothing to do with ISIS. John McCain, the former presidency, was seen a number of times with the Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the chief of ISIS. And ISIS was created as a Sunni army to start what's so-called the Sunni-Shia war in the Middle East, which did not happen yet. And I am not very optimistic, though the Russians were very successful in Syria, but I don't think that the U.S. will give up its plan to start such a war in the Middle East, because they've invested a huge amount of money in this project. And so far, it's a big fiasco. It's not successful. In Yemen, it's not working out. The war between the Shia and the Sunni it almost will be over within a month or two. In Syria, the intervention of the Russians turned the whole table. But still, I think the monster that the U.S. created using the fanatics, whether they're coming from Russia, whether they're coming from Syria, from Egypt, from Iraq, the U.S. created that particular monster. And I think the problem is it will backfire. Because once you start violence, you really cannot stop you cannot draw a line and say, okay, violence will stop right over here. You cannot do that. I think the U.S. created the monster, a Frankenstein in the Middle East, and so far the U.S. themselves did not, the regular citizens did not really experience the same agony that the people in the Middle East suffered from. So actually there is the fingerprints of the U.S. is all over the Islamic terrorism.
Obviously, the American media, the media in the West, doesn't highlight that there is the possibility that America or Western intelligence agencies could be part and parcel of the creation of groups such as Daesh. And I'm wondering, but they do help to stir up the anti-Islamic, hate, the whole Islamophobia. They'll do that happily. But when it comes to perhaps shedding light on the plight even of average Muslims, every day perhaps if you see or if you watch local media, for example in the United Kingdom, there's almost every day a hate crime against a Muslim by an average citizen. He will be hit, he will be abused, he will be verbally abused, and so on and so forth. These crimes go largely unpunished. But I'm wondering now, what does one do? Do we as a community, do we as other Arab and Muslim countries have a role to play? President al-Sisi, for example, has called time and time again for the restructuring and the renovation of the Islamic discourse, and yet we have seen nothing.
We need a cultural revolution. We have the whole culture with us. So actually we need a cultural revolution. You cannot really change the religious speech unless you change a lot of things that surrounds it. Education and media will have to play a major role in that. We have to connect with other religions. We're going to have to, to present the moderate Islam. We need to do a lot of work in order to present the good face of Islam. Till today, in rural areas and the countryside, you have a very backward speeches in the mosques. And you need to really qualify the people who are leading Muslims in this direction. We need to new qualities in the Muslims.
Why do you think, Mr. Hussein, this hasn't taken off? This whole need, this whole desire, this whole calling for time and time again for the religious discourse to be reviewed?
First of all, it's not a fundamental issue.
Right.
Egypt was liberal during the first liberal era from till after the 1919 revolution till 1952. And it continued to be liberal as well during Nasser's regime. And the countryside Engineer Hassan was referring to was actually the main pump of bringing Egypt its great intellectuals like Tahsin, like Tawfiq Hakim, like Yahya Haqqi, like Yusuf Idris, like everybody. So the countryside was illuminated. However, that backward kind of look is not really fundamental to the Egyptian grounds. It was magnified by a regime who decided to shed his eyes about what's happening from the Muslim Brotherhood, and he just led them as a cat in the fire. So that has definitely transformed the countryside. It has transformed the random areas. It has transformed the rural areas. As with the influx coming back from the Gulf,
Right.
with the new falsified Egyptian culture, wearing abayas, wearing niqabs. So it became a fashion, and everybody fold in. So it doesn't take a hero to change that.
Right.
However, we have to be extremely honest with ourselves. You cannot negate a phenomena by taking an anti kind of measure. I cannot say, for example, if I want to gain back that backwardness, that hijab is wrong, right? I don't believe in hijab. I don't believe that it is fundamental to any kind of Islamic doctrine. However, when I'm dealing with that matter, I should not tackle it in an aggressive way.
You've chosen a very sensitive issue. There are
Because
other issues.
there are other sensitive issues as well.
But don't you think it's more about spreading the knowledge that ad-din al-akhlaq, it is about manners, and it is about how one interacts with the other, and how Muslims interact, not just amongst Muslims. You're not just my brother because we share the same religion. You're my brother in this world regardless. You are human, and that's
that's non-religious. That's irreligious, right? We have to spread
no, of course not.
akhlaq.
It's completely related, because this is what the Prophet was like.
No, I mean the discourse does not necessarily have to be a totally religious. We're trying to build a discourse. We're trying to build a new kind of ideology, though I hate the term. But you have to have some sort of ideas. If we leave it to the religious structure to do it, they will never do it, because they are happy with that. They are benefiting from that. They are teaching from that. They are on the spatial channels for that. It's their bread and butter. And if we leave it to the so-called men of letters or the cultured people, they are tagged as laik, as Almanis. And Almanis is always a connotation from the other side that they are atheists. It has to be, it takes two to tango.
Right.
We have to build a new identity for Egypt that is not religious. However, it accepts different religions. It accepts religiosity. If you want to be a religious person, fine with us.
I to focus or to put the spotlight on Egypt, I'm thinking if we have this extremist ideology that's been affecting the Muslim nation as a nation, that needs to be tackled by the main Islamic institutions, be they Al-Azhar or in Saudi Arabia.
This is a recipe for disaster.
Because you can't say, I condemn this violence.
That's why it never happened. During the liberal era or during Nasser era, Al-Azhar or the church was not leading the society. The society was leading itself because it had an enlightenment project.
Right.
And Al-Azhar and the church fold in, right? But to go and ask Al-Azhar or the church for a new religious discourse, this is kind of dreaming.
Right.
It will never happen. They are not qualified to do it. However, in trying to build that new identity for Egypt, we should not be conventional with the religious structure. We have to be accommodating. We have to be extremely sensitive. We're talking here cultural sensitivity with the West.